The politics in the United States between 1848 through 1860. The politics in the U.S. between 1848 and 1860 was also important in understanding Carvajal's disposition that encouraged him to filibustering as it did, which subsequently contributed to the existing fragile relationship between Mexico and the United States. The U.S. would see a series of presidents whose views towards Mexico would differ significantly, which shapes foreign policy during this time. For example, James K. Polk, who became president in 1844, was also an expansionist at heart, which actually pushed foreign policy in that direction during his administration, followed by the election of General Zachary Taylor, a president who believes that the U.S. did not need any more territory to acquire or develop. After Taylor's death, Vice President Millard Fillmore, who was also a Whig, also opposed territorial expansion, but the idea remained strong with the American public. The relationship with Mexico would degrade further at this time by around 1852, when Franklin Pierce won the presidential election with the support of the expansionists. As a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. will have no more obligations to stop the ever-present Indian raids into Mexico, and Pierce will not station enough troops along the border to guarantee safety on either side. Essentially, any filibustering expeditions that were carried out throughout this time did not receive enough concern from the Pierce administration. Moreover, upon the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, the U.S. was headed directly into a civil war, which tables all desires for acquisition of additional territory. So this leaves filibustering expeditions virtually unchecked during this chaotic period of time. And between 1848 and 1855, adventurers took advantage of the political and economic climate in Mexico and in the United States, becoming more motivated to organize and lead filibustering expeditions, driven by the profit motive and conquest. Some filibustered from the New Mexico area, while others entered illegally into Mexico from California. But while there were a considerable number of filibusters who entered into Mexico illegally, people like Joseph C. Moreland and John McDougal in 1855, we will closely examine the filibustero Jose Maria J. Carvajal. Before we begin to discuss Carvajal in more detail, we should lay out some of the circumstances that motivated Carvajal to participate in filibusters throughout northern Mexico. First, one of the agreements of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was that the U.S. sought a guarantee that all goods brought into the country of Mexico would not be subjected to import duties or confiscation. Soon after the withdrawal of the U.S. Army, the Mexican government failed to fulfill its part of the treaty. Instead, the Mexican government imposed higher tariff duties designed to prohibit American goods from entering the country, which in turn angers many Americans. Also, the potential for monetary gain soon precipitates smuggling, which became profitable for merchants along the border. The American merchants were not the only group opposed to the tariffs. The inhabitants of northern Mexico desired American products and were also opposed to the policy of their own government. Around this time, the Galveston Weekly News stated that the Mexican trade restrictions fostered ill feelings among the inhabitants of northern Mexico. They said, "We believe that the truth of the matter is that the late rigid enforcement of the restrictive commercial laws of Mexico along the Rio Grande, operating almost as oppressively as a blockade upon the ports, is rapidly preparing the population for revolt." So this begs the question, how did Carvajal get mixed up in filibustering in the first place? The answer was that he was selected by revolutionaries from Mexico that opposed these same tariffs. In 1851, these same revolutionaries met in La Loba, Mexico, and formulated what was called El Plan de la Loba. Before Carvajal can do anything, he flees to the U.S. because of the Mexican military presence. While on this side of the river, specifically Rio Grande City, he acquires money from the merchants and begins to recruit for his first filibustering expedition. The Telegraph and Texas Register April 4, 1852 edition states that Carvajal had the support of not only the Mexican troops but also the merchants on the Texas side of the Rio Grande. While situated in Rio Grande City, the Galveston Weekly News reported that Carvajal recruited about 200 men, and on September the 20th, 1851, he proceeds to cross the Rio Grande with his army to capture Camargo with no opposition. Oddly, the Austin, Texas State Gazette was the only paper that did not support the filibustering expedition. The paper reported that the size of the American force involved was not adequate to supply a victory, and the size was just large enough to be troublesome. Furthermore, the paper also felt that Carvajal was not suited for the position because he was void of principle and patriotism. Moreover, the paper did not condemn the principle of filibustering, only Carvajal's expedition. Various newspapers followed and reported on every engagement. One outlet, the Western Texian, writes that Carvajal established his camp in the conquered town of Camargo and waited for his second-in-command, John Rip Ford, to join the group. Finally, Ford arrives on October the 1st with about 30 former Texas Rangers who had recently mustered out of service. Ford was then commissioned as a colonel and was placed in command of the troops by Carvajal himself. There were a number of volunteers that comprised this filibustering affair. One of the volunteers was Shadow Robert O. Wheat, who had served with another filibuster in Cuba and would later join William Walker's filibustering ventures in Nicaragua. While another volunteer happened to be Joseph P. Howell, a brother-in-law of Jefferson Davis, he would command a volunteer group of about 60 men that were recruited from New Orleans. When all the preparations were in place, Carvajal's advance guard marched towards Matamoros, and October 20th, 1851, laid siege to the town. Shortly thereafter, by October 30, Carvajal raises the siege and makes a tactical retreat from the city. Although the reasons for Carvajal's withdrawal are unknown, historians agree that it may have been due to the approaching Mexican army and perhaps a lack of adequate medical supplies that prompted that decision. Nevertheless, the newspaper, the Texas State Gazette, reported that on November 22, 1851, that there can be little doubt that Matamoros fell into the hands of Carvajal on Friday or Saturday last. While another newspaper, the Northern Standard, reports that all have faithfully discharged their duty that describe Carvajal's progress in the region. Carvajal was very determined to continue this incursion. The fighting would continue for 10 days, and about 400 men who lived in and around Brownsville, Texas, joined the filibusters. Apparently, it was learned that some of the men would return back to their homes at night and rejoin the battle against the besieged town the next day. An unforeseen outcome of this incursion into Mexico seemed to be that it directly revitalizes the economy on both sides of the border. The Texas State Gazette printed news that the invasion had stimulated trade, and during a 3-day period, about $300,000 worth of merchandise had made its way into the Matamoros area. As Carvajal and his men pressed forward, the Western Texian printed news that Ford and his men repeatedly tried to capture the main plaza of Matamoros, and during one of these attempts, Ford was wounded in the head and was rushed back to Brownsville. Unable to continue the fighting, Ford would remain there during the attack on Matamoros. Unfortunately, the tide of battle changes against the interlopers. Carvajal is forced to make a tactical withdrawal. Instead of completely disengaging to the U.S. side, he decides that the best course of action is to retreat along the Mexican side of the Rio Grande, where he renews attacks, this time on the town of Cerralbo on the 26th of November. Inexplicably, the filibusters were not aware that the town has quartered about 220 Mexican troops who then successfully go on to resist Carvajal's army, and after 2 days he is forced to withdraw from the town. The filibuster receives rumors that there was an approaching Mexican force and decides to retreat across the Rio Grande to prepare for a second invasion. After Carvajal's retreat across the Rio Grande, many of his filibusters deserted the campaign, which creates a shortage of available men to sustain the invasion. So Rip Ford was sent to Austin to recruit more men, but the effort turned out to be a complete failure. Nevertheless, later on, Carvajal manages to increase the ranks of new volunteers and prepares for a second invasion of Mexico. Once more, on February the 20th, 1852, He crosses the Rio Grande with a force that totals about 200 men and proceeds to attack the town of Camargo again. Tragically, Carvajal is met by a Mexican force who battle the filibusters, forcing most of them to retreat for their lives. However, Carvajal somehow manages to regroup and with the help of about 80 men stood his ground and eventually repulses the Mexican force. As news of his activities reaches the White House, it catches the attention of the Fillmore administration, which prompts an intervention. Therefore, on September the 24th, 1851, the President instructs the Western Division of the Army to intervene and stop the expedition. Fillmore issues a warning to the American public on October the 22nd. However, the Army was unable to fulfill the order until March 8, 1852. And while en route to Brownsville, on the American side of the river, Carvajal was arrested by Lieutenant John Gibbons. However, Carvajal was able to post bond for his appearance at the June session of the District Court. At his trial, the jury found him not guilty of violating the neutrality laws of 1818. This raises yet another question. Why did Carvajal devote all his energies with such plans to filibuster into Mexico? What was at stake? Well, Carvajal had aspirations to establish an independent republic based on American principles, but this pursuit was reaching its end around this time. Once again, Carvajal is not deterred. He manages to get more support, rounds up more volunteers, and proceeds to make his way into Mexico yet again. On March 26, 1853, Carvajal, along with a small force, sacks the town of Reynosa and then demands a ransom of about 30,000. The poor residents of the town only managed to raise 2,000 of the 30,000 ransom that Carvajal demanded. With the ransom in hand, he leaves the town and makes his way to Rio Grande City, where he was met by Major Gabriel R. Paul on March 31st. He was immediately arrested once again and taken to Brownsville. Carvajal was unable to post bail this time, and he remains in jail until May. After this release, Carvajal would fail to mount another filibuster expedition like he had done so before. Rumors would circulate for the next few years that he was again amassing men for yet another attempt at filibustering, but these reports turned out to be false. Similarly, the Carvajal expedition, like most other filibustering excursions, had ended in total failure. Nevertheless, the Carvajal expedition had the distinction to be described as the first filibustering force to be mounted by the Texas press. The use of the term filibuster became more widely accepted by 1852 in the Texas press. Moreover, the press, once supportive of Carvajal, consequently turns on him after the last disastrous filibustering attempt. The Texas State Gazette shifts the blame for failure on the Mexican filibusters and depicts them as meek and fearful of combat, while portraying the Americans as men who would obey an order to the death. While yet another paper, the Rio Grande Bravo, reported that a ripcord had been wounded, the Americans would have been victorious. By this time, it seems that the entire Texas press grew tired of such activity, as the January 1st, 1852 edition of the San Antonio Ledger devoted this poignant passage that summarizes the Carvajal debacle. The people on the Rio Grande were suffering no oppressions. There was no yoke on their necks which they desired to throw off. They were left by the government of Mexico to do pretty much as they pleased, and if they had any grievances to complain of, Carvajal was the last man they would have called to redress them. The Carvajal story is compelling for a variety of reasons, one of which is that he happened to be of Hispanic origin at a time when filibusters were all white Norte Americanos. However, it seems that ethnicity itself was not a factor because filibustering was an activity that attracted opportunists despite the risks. That being said, Carvajal's justifications to filibuster in Mexico centers on several distinct possibilities. Carvajal seized an opportunity to form a business alliance with both Mexican and Anglo merchants and starts to plan an insurrection of the northern provinces of Tamaulipas and Nuevo León, wanting to found a new state and subsequently call it the Republic of the Sierra Madre. One should also consider Mexico's ongoing internal political instability. namely the shifting of control between the centralists and the conservatives. Such internal strife kept Mexico from committing more resources to quell filibusters like Carvajal. Certainly, Santa Anna's act of ceding more land to the United States made matters worse because it triggers the so-called War of the Reform. Finally, the period of the French intervention also prevented Mexico from sending military forces to stop any insurrections. Given this scenario, Carvajal was somewhat free to roam anywhere in Mexico with little opposition. And as always, thank you for listening. This concludes our two-part series on the filibuster Jose Maria J. Carvajal. If you have any questions or if you have any ideas for my next video, please feel free to post them on the comments below. Once again, thank you for listening.